It has been now many decades that I'm immersed in what people call classical music. To me, it sounds like a dead language for them. But beyond the escapism, time traveling, and immersion in the storytelling from a different time period, culture, possibly because of the language which is used to communicate and therefore to pray, think, imagine, dream, love or hate, express some kind of a civilizational display towards the finitude and the expectation of life, and fighting survival till the death which ultimately is inevitable. But all civilizations dealt differently with faith, with what is the meaning of it all. And I find that music called classical is factually the instrument for reflection. You can listen to music and have thoughts about spiritual uplifting or about carnal desires or about excitement through the pulse of the rhythm that talks to your psyche. It's enticing or soothing. It could be as well, sometimes both. Alternatively, but within the same piece or music or song or whatever you want to call track, downloaded file, music paper or electronic version, whichever way it is in fact displayed, it is some kind of subliminal communication about what these people have passed through their earthly life and what they considered meaningful mainly to retain from it. They do it more or less consciously, but there is always a moment in any human life where, regardless our personal drawbacks and fights and hopes and desperation and basically life in its variety of intense experience, and it forges the character besides and beyond the DNA and besides and beyond the culture and besides and beyond the ideologies and besides and beyond the sort of attributed belonging to a group, nation or ethnic or cultural or linguistic or historic. Most of the time the musical approach is more individual because it calls for this reflection. Of course, you do seduction through the sounds, how they're sensual, sensitive, or harsh, or provocative, or ironic, or generally they speak more directly to the psyche because they don't have to go through a language which has to be translated. And every translation brings a certain change to the very choice, the juicy choice of the word, the tasty choice of the word, which carries within a certain language another series of subliminal messages that are hinted by the cultural knowledge of this language, not just the meaning of the word, but all the other meanings of the word that is specifically chosen can spawn and hint in between the lines to the person who can read it and identify or find it entertaining or self-revealing. After all, the comedy is the best way to laugh at our own shortcomings, even if we don't feel personally targeted, but we feel in a communal way we are part of the trend that is told in the storytelling. And very often from silent movies to today, from ancient Rome or Greece theaters till today, it's storytelling through expressions, facial, emotional, suggestive. And in many ways, the body language from dance, through dance, towards the expression of the unnameable, undefinable. Of course, great writers manage to define it by making the right choice of word that touches like an arrow its heart of target. And you feel like you're touched or moved when you read a story and you imagine it, or you watch it and you are moved by the way the director has made the choices of the scenes that bring you to the point to which you feel this compassion or emotion for this character, or then you identify, or then you consider it your archenemy and you define it better as an enemy. All these elements that I grew up with in music since I was a child, born in Bulgaria from a Greek mother, raised in France and teaching in America, what does it mean? Does it mean it's just anywhere is everywhere? No, of course not. And the time period also matters a lot. Geostrategically, in terms of the social interaction, where are the talent for future musicians most fruitful? And what is the attraction towards a classical tradition of music through centuries of development that is now globalized towards bringing the desire to students who come from extra-European backgrounds and belongings to adapt, demand to have a legitimacy to belong to this by election. And paradoxically, the descendants of the ancient civilizations are far from being the ones who are their most best, let's say, representatives. Perhaps they search also for other levels of exotism, where they search in other cultures than their own, let's say the European for classical music. The next inspiration, would it be for modal? Would it be for ethnomusicological? Because there are countries with ethnic backgrounds, regardless of their size, which have very intense and strong musical tradition that is inevitably related to the oral transmission. And then for nationalistic or ethnomusicological needs, a foreigner can identify with another foreigner as musical heritage. It's not belonging only to those who, so to say, ethnically or come culturally from the place where this music originated or developed. And so I think that that is the beauty of music. It's not this universalism that makes it tasteless or some kind of a general consensus that brings the music to become some kind of a consumer element of course, not everybody who enjoys without to perform, but if you study and then you want to perform, is that you have an attraction in the first place, then you learn about the point of how the specific culture that was around the time of the composing of this music that you play influenced the expression of tension, release harmonically, or in emotional aspect, the drive, the anxiety, the hope, the delay, the longing. The classicism, the romanticism, it goes together with literature, with painting, with sculpture, with architecture, with garden scaping. It's just a whole aspect of mankind dominating nature, organizing nature, shaping nature, agriculture, architecture, cities versus countryside, and the awareness of the musicians in the case of classical music, like other creators in different forms of art forms, meaning I don't know how much they were really aware, or were they just trying to survive by pleasing, inevitably for survival, whoever gave them the opportunity to survive by serving this religion and that religion where they were. In other words, their talent was their key to survival. And a Haydn or a Tallis or any of these Handel court composers were there to please their bosses. They wasn't called yet sponsors or whatever form of necessity or fashion to support frivolous situations like art. Would it be haute couture? Would it be even things that appear so superficial to the daily life of economics in the world, and the political greeds and the wars and the dominations and the world domination, which seems to be since ever on earth for humans the drive. But they always need in fact, of course, soldiers, economists, politicians, diplomats, to advance their interests and their personal ambitions. But meanwhile, when you visit museums of past histories of the world, would it be the art of Africa, the art of Europe, of Asia, whichever conquests militarily won deprived the country from its cultural background by bringing it to their own museums, and then it becomes colonial attitude. But beyond all these enormous trends of human transhumance and human changes of balances of the world's leading powers, there are these individuals, and that's what strikes me the most. Those individuals in classical music, they composed music, okay, to serve, okay, to survive, okay, in great quantity because it was a daily necessity. There's no way to conserve music like today and record it and print it and electronic forms. And who knows in the future how many more there will be forms of that. But somebody has to create them. And of course, the translation of the language is like the translation from the musical page. That's why interpreter is etymologically a translator. So in the art of translation, you convey the meaning, and you try to convey the choice of the word that you cannot use because in a way perhaps it's untranslatable, because in some cultures they reach a certain connection between words that can be misunderstood in the usage of a similar meaningful word in another language. And then, in fact, yes, you get on the surface the point of the story, or if it is a myth or a reality or a combination of two. And regardless, but the fact is that unless you can read it in the original language, and so many dead tongues exist that people, archaeologists specifically, are of course very much acutely aware of. And so it depends of which translation of the Bible you read to understand or misunderstand the meaning of this or that through several languages already before it reaches the one of the tongue that you use. So there is a sense of relativity to all of that. The truth is a point of view, and the way it's narrated is the way people understand it. And that's why very often the words, while less powerful than weapons in terms of physical killing, they can erase the awareness with time passing of greatnesses of cultures, of civilizations, either by ignoring them, either by erasing them, either by misleading us into thinking what they were not. And of course, outside of context, after hundreds and thousands of years, all this becomes unrelated. Well, it's relatable to the people who search and study it, just like a classical musician who is trained to practice music of different centuries, time periods, acoustical and cultural awarenesses, and what was around then, surrounding the time when this was created. But then beyond that, it becomes timeless. It becomes universal. And not because it blends in with anything, anywhere, anytime, but specifically because it's very much symbolizing its culture, its civilization, its meaning, its beliefs. And I find that here we touch the point that I wanted to deeply share with you. From all these decades that I play music, or I compose music, or I'm basically in music, as I said in the beginning of our meeting. It is individuals who reach, in fact, the culture of their election. Most of the time is the one that they come from, like the mother tongue. But then they can become fluent in a second tongue that you learn by the book, which is not as fluent perhaps, but which opens you windows of understanding another portion of the world history, culture, and background. And the more you learn about diverse forms from within, which is the key to it, which is the language, then you understand things. For instance, if you read War and Peace in Russian, you start understanding the meanings of some words. For instance, in Russian, drug means other, but really means friend. So my other is my friend. So that meaning of the words beyond their significance cultivates us to understand why some choices are made in music too. And what I wanted to convey to you is that the individualities, while belonging to their cultures linguistically, culturally, ethnically, sometimes, or not just linguistically, not all countries are ethnic, and if so, their capacity to absorb other cultures, either by economic domination, either by colonialism, then they adopt it through the language. And but they still develop, mushrooming their own specific necessity to express through their characteristics, would it be their personality characters because of geographic situations next to the sea or in the mountains, or what kind of character it builds in the human psyche, or people who have to fight the snow most of the year than those who, for instance, have never to even be clothed, so to say, because a lot of this is part of the mindset of things. And cultures develop in specific places in specific ways because of the whole ecosystem in which they are. But the individuals can think outside of that box. They can dream for something else. They want, it's not just escapism, it's perhaps an early form of universalism. Not a likeness, but individuality that develops a sense of style that makes people want to dance, a certain dance that is invented in a place which is so foreign to them, but where the pulse or the rhythm or the very impulse, literally, means to them so much. And so they can study because of their attraction for, let's say, flamenco, and be in northern Japan. And that doesn't mean that they have to move to southern Spain in order to learn it. They can find ways, of course, today more than ever, through the internet, but you can have Italian restaurants in every country other than Italy, and Chinese restaurants in any country than China. And that doesn't mean that they're authentically according to the people's specialties, tastes. Perhaps they adapt also to the tastes of the people whom they serve, with the flavor of what the people expect the Italian or the Chinese food to be in the taste buds. And when Bach wrote a French suite or an English suite, he wanted to give to his fellow countrymen in northern Germany the tastes of this kind of exotism, which was by election, even if in fact he didn't do any ethnomusicological research much to it, or the Italianate style for the concerto, the Italian concerto. Is it more the form, fast, slow, fast, or is it specific effects of melodic or other characteristic of the mood? It's difficult to find that because unlike other composers, for instance, who traveled, like Handel, by case of obligation, since the Prince of Hanover in northern Germany, whom he served, became by a succession king of England. So inevitably that was you have this European awareness, while you have this difference of culture. You have also the unity of the tonal system in music that unified for so many centuries, the customized differences by countries. And so it takes an individual like Froberger to go to study with, from Germany, century or so before Bach, or roughly, to study with Frescobaldi in Rome. And then go through the French court of the king's son, and then be inspired by Louis Couperin's meeting musically. To which extent is that traveling is the openness of the mind? Yes. Now, cross-pollinating like this, cultures, some are more aware of the differences and adopt them and sponge them and filter them and make it so that somebody who wants to express a revolt about something in society that is unjust in any other country can use the rap pattern of pulse, rhythm, speech, tempo, and pace. And so you can have rap in many languages, but nevertheless it shares some communality with a genre that was born in the Bronx or so in America. And same thing can be said for composers in classical music who were itinerant in the early Romantic era, like Liszt, who toured as a concert pianist so many European countries, given the difficulties to travel of the time. He was just an unbelievable traveler. So was Liszt, as I said, Chopin, perhaps to a lesser extent. But nevertheless, coming from a attributed but not belittling culture like Hungary, the Hungarian culture of Liszt is relative because he was part of the Austrian Empire, and so yes, he was more Germanic with Latin knowledge, and he became a priest in Rome, but also French in literature and culture. And so the languages were for him the different trades, political, economical, philosophical, poetic. Living in Weimar, Goethe lived in Weimar. So the capacity of immersing in the way people think the world in terms of its essence and meaning in different countries is more about their culture. But then there are these individuals who define it and who appropriate it. And so, yes, Chopin wrote mazurkas because it was exotic to the Parisian audience to be Polish. Today, with the traveling situation, the exotism has to be searched further, perhaps in other planets by now. But it's an attraction, the exotism, is the other, is the alterity, is the other than me. And then you have these influences. The Russian court in the 18th century wanted to be Germanic or build buildings like Versailles Castle because it was the beacon to be imitated. And then you have the American universalism. The Great Britain is the empire on the sun that never sets, and then Asian empires and so on. And what you think about the Austrian Empire is that it was really a conglomerate of what became nationalities after World War I, but which were regional, personal, more or less stifled originalities. Would it be by their local languages, into their local dances, to their locals' ways of worshipping through or with music? The Orthodox Church in Russia or in Bulgaria or in Greece doesn't call for an instrument in church. It's all sang by the worshippers. But the organ developed in the Catholic Roman Church all over the Mediterranean countries and into the north, and became part of the worshipping through the wind pipes of the instrument, either supporting the singing, either by itself. And so you can go in other countries and discover that they have more percussive music in their DNA of their culture. And you can have people who travel and who sort of, even in the modern days of the late 19th, early 20th century, became more or less, besides themselves, ethnomusicologists for classical music. Bartók in the Balkans, or either they travel as a concert pianist like Liszt did and bring themselves everywhere, or they go somewhere so far from their culture that they absorb some of it and translate it in their own music. Albéniz wrote the music of Spain. In music, he translates the different moods, situations, gatherings of people, talking, liveliness. You hear the Albéniz music, you are in Spain in an imaginary way. You travel with sound images, so to say. Same with Greek music, same with countries that have very defined culture. And then, of course, the problem is that if this is an oral transmission, people like Bartok, Godowski, as a concert pianist, traveled all the way to Indonesia and wrote Java Suite because of his, I guess, bedazzlement of something so exotic. And so they either do it by election appropriation, either because of their roots as an assertion, and then it becomes their signature, and that could be said of Russian music of the early 19th century into the late Romanticism. And so there is something there that touches us very much in the way people travel through music, in their minds, in their dreams, in their thoughts, and then, of course, the fashions of what is fashionable. Opera was Italianate, since it was imagined and organized first in Italy, or what was to become Italy, not yet politically, but the culture. And then they started having the expression of their national mythology, like Wagner for German, in German, Debussy with the French opera, in reaction to the Wagnerism, like Péléas and Mélisande, in French, and about French mythology, or at least all these imaginary ways to use in a sort of cultural propaganda. Is it because, or if not because of occupation of territories in the past, or economic and cultural appropriation with colonialism. And then you have Chopin, who in fact is Parisian and from a French father, but his identification as a musician is Polish. But his musical language, notational, and expression of the grammar of his music is the tonal system that Bach used even before Bach. He didn't, he adapted, and he stylized, so to say, but it is truly probably the right word, more than customized, the cultural inheritance of the oral tradition, which in agricultural societies was mostly dance, or songs around weddings, around funerals, around any communal situations in the village. And so if you hear a mazurka from Masuria, or you hear a mazurka by Chopin, you won't recognize it because he has Parisianized it, even if he kept the title. But he felt, or he was, or through him, he filtered it. Tchaikovsky uses popular Russian tunes. Schubert uses Ländlers, which is the country songs, quoting them in their music, respectively, Tchaikovsky and Schubert, for instance. And they have this necessity to be popular in the sense of there was no pop music compared to classical music until basically the beginning of the 20th century. So there was lighter and heavy music, there was church music and entertainment music, there was secular, and of course then you have different levels of musical music as the soundtrack of the lives of the rich, who could afford to have real live musicians to play it unless they can learn themselves how to. But there was no way to find reproducible music to be played on the radio, on the recording, or on the MP, or and all that. Therefore, in all this musical necessity for the, let's say, ritualistic situations, would it be from the oral tradition or the written, these rituals needed music, marching for soldiers and marching for funeral marches and dancing for societal situations in the courts, and having those elaborate dances that were in fact social interactions or even diplomatic situations. When you transform a dance like sarabande from a very, so to say, risque South American dance that the conquistadors brought back in Spain, and the Queen of Spain switched to a stately slow dance, the sarabande from Zarabanda. So there is always an appropriation of the culture of another, either by force, either by cultural way of developing it into something else. And probably the written notation of music, of classical music, was a way to perpetuate what was lost ephemerally by the fact of the oral transmission, no matter how close the generations were, since people lived very short time in the early centuries. And therefore, nevertheless, the music evolved by generations, perhaps very, 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 very subtly in little increments, but did, until it reached us. And then when we have it notated, then we have it in fact adopted, perhaps deformed, perhaps even betrayed from its ethnic roots, appropriately so, because the notation asks for a certain organization of the system, which is all about it. You have bar lines, you have structure of group of bars, you have notation that defines the speeds and the pitches. And then you have also indications in either Italian language, because of the opera for so many centuries, and that's how the metronomic marking are in Italian, because of the marketing of the metronome by Melzel in Vienna in 1820s. And of course, later then in different languages, Schumann in German, as I said, Debussy in French, Wagner, of course, also in German, because they use then their culture and their pride of their language, be the translation of their pride. Even composers like Albéniz published Iberia in France with French markings, and now they're published with Spanish markings. And of course, these are things that are inevitable to be connected, because either it is composers like Villa-Lobos, who wrote Bachianas Brasileiras, Brazilian backings. That's basically the rough translation of installing a classical music tradition in countries that didn't have such, even if into the 20th century or even late 19th century, and you have this kind of national founders of classical music, through notation mainly, schools of music in countries that either came out from the dismantling of the empires and became a sign of their own identity. Would it be chauvinistic, or would it be nationalistic, or would it be just a pride that needs to be displayed, thankfully, non-militarily? But it becomes then a phenomenon that people like to hear beyond only its own identity. And so in pop music, you have the same situation, where it's more marketing than influential situation, but nevertheless, there is pop, rock, rap, all over the world, and jazz as well, in different ways of declination of it, according to the countries and the people who share it with their own audiences. Of course, today, everything is accessible from anywhere in terms of cultural content, and the idea that everything looks alike is a little bit scary, because some people prefer to keep what made their originality. But ultimately, when you hear music by Mozart, or let's say by Albéniz, you hear music. Of course, you hear an Austrian composer, and then you hear a Spanish composer. But beyond, you hear music. And I insist on that because there is a communality in the language. And I think that you can have more influenced composers by a culture because they went to seek it rather than to belong to it only, but by bringing their own background or their own creativity. For instance, Fauré, who was a famous professor of composition in the Paris Conservatoire in the very late 19th century and early 20th century, in his studio, besides my teacher as a child, then Mademoiselle Boulanger from Russian mom, while French dad, she had as a famous co-student Ravel from a Basque Spanish mother and Swiss father. And then he had, for instance, in the same studio, at the same time, another individuality that is George Enescu, who is Romanian, and who was also, like all of them, immersed in the style that Fauré was teaching, which beyond French by his culture, though he came from South France and had his also regional accent. I'm just emphasizing all these very subtle but important details that are part of what all this becomes before it becomes universal. And Fauré's influence musically, as he went to study in a church musician school, the Niedermeyer School. His father couldn't afford the Paris Conservatory, and the Niedermeyer School gave him full tuition, and so he lived and grew up in this school, not far from the Paris Conservatory, which was a secular school for musicians. And by marriage, he became, in fact, director of the Paris Conservatory when he grew up in the school, musically speaking, of the church musicians, where they studied, of course, extensively then, and that influenced his own view of music, the Gregorian chant, and which was abandoned as a teaching at the time in the secular conservatoire, and he reinstated it when he became director of it. And there were a lot of controversies about this, because it's like fashion and time. Bach's second son, Johann, well, they were all Johanns except him, Carl Philipp Emanuel, the second one, the CPE, who was court composer in Dresden. He told his dad, please don't play your fugues when you come here to visit, because now it's ballet and opera, and not your austere music, which was for Bach famous for fugues and cantatas, in other words, church music. And if already in his own son's eyes Bach was a old-fashioned person within the same country, imagine what is the perception from another culture point of view. But that's, I think personally, is a very enriching situation, because in pianists' world of the early 20th century, Russian, Polish, German, French were considered sort of the owners of the culture of playing piano. Virtuosity, students of Liszt, students of Chopin, by students of, and so on. Traditions of the Russian school, tradition of the French school, jeu perlé, pearled playing, or the Russian school, magnet deep in the keys of the fingers, never disconnecting from the keys. And this was a way to say we are the world champions of this. Nobody can reach our level of evolution in the art of piano teaching, playing, and performing. And of course, in this cultural system of theirs, they adopted how to play the music of Bach in a Russian taste, and music of Beethoven with a French taste in the different music schools of the countries. And this defined music schools, nothing but for interpretation, that less composition, were already very much of a staple until the world opened to the Americas, to Asia, in terms of the classical music, the publications, the editions, the teaching, the recordings, the videos, the capacity to attract to something that is important, because it is not from where you come, but it's where you want to be, because it attracts you. It could be French cancan as a dance, or is it a ballet at the opera? It's always about attraction. What is then genuinely in the music, translating it so that it's not only believable like an actor on stage, but it becomes a creation that people want to hear. An Italian opera, a German opera, a French opera, before the movies, the films, the series, the video games, and who knows the next forms of storytelling or interacting or passive active, many ways combining the different forms of arts and different industries to reach to three-dimensional film storytelling, or in the past an opera by essence in Italian work. It was the combination of the work of the electricians who, or before electricity with candles, were lighting the stage, to stage directors, to set designers, to combine with dancers and singers and musicians in the orchestra pit for the soundtrack, so to say, a conductor combining all in real time. And so you can tell a storytelling in three dimension for the time. And then today with the technologies, it becomes through the virtual more real, but it's always in fact the translation of an imagination, of a storytelling, of a world in which you want to be immersed as a watcher, as a listener, as a spectator, as a dreamer. Or then use the opportunity to hear a music which allows you to withdraw within yourself, even if you're among others. But the reflection of what the music brings you in the solace, or in the questioning, philosophically speaking, that music provokes in us individually at different levels, with different awarenesses and different capacities of, let's say, perceiving the subtleties of the message. And so, of course, people then become curious when they love something to know more about it. Sometimes it's double-edged, because it doesn't mean because you know more that you will love more, but because you're curious according to the first attraction that could be something that you can't even put in words, but it's just attracting you. Like a person, a smile, a gaze, a smell, a way of walking, and you fall in love with somebody's soul, in fact, through the way it's emanating through their body, the way they emanate their own charm or personality, depth, humor, or type of humor, or level of emotional communication, of compassion, or capacity to emulate your own culture. And then you have this kind of exchange of differences, or completion of opposites, or then opposition of opposites, inevitably sometimes too. Nothing is just linear like that. But the fact is that if classical music is often defined when studied not only by time periods and stylistic differences for those time periods, and where they come from in terms of type of countries that existed before they disappeared, or conglomerates of countries within empires, whatever it was. We visit these museums, we go to the concert halls, we watch the works of art through history, which in fact were made by individuals. And we attach ourselves to a specific style of a painting that provokes in us something that doesn't provoke in another of us. And so we choose which type of painting we like, which type of film we like, which type of genre of this or that we like. And then we change either with age or socio-cultural situation, or because we want to be cultivated, not appear dumb. We try to be understanding, or we pretend. Or sometimes it's fashionable to pretend this and fashionable not to pretend that. Whichever reasons. We evolve. That's all it is. And sometimes we say, oh God, look at what I wore when I was young. It's ridiculous. But at that time it was fashionable, and you thought it was hype. You know, that's why I think classical music is timeless and is very individual. And even if people want to reduce it to Spanish composers like Granados and Albéniz, Russian composers like Borodin and Tchaikovsky, among a few, of course, for each, or the French music with Fauré, Ravel, Debussy, and way more. But each of them, in each of these, are so different. Even if they come from a common cultural background in terms of language, at least. Not always with the genetic background, or perhaps the religious background, or the way they they coalesce around an ideology or a faith, and it's fine. That's what defines them as group, while they're individuals, and they can still be inspired or influenced or enticed by other situations. You know, the Romeo and Juliet story forever. The opposites attract. Love is blind. But all these are cliches that are in fact often proven, but beyond that, it means that the human inner seeking of the psyche, of the soul, is way beyond the boundaries of this country, this system, this organization of people owning these other people, or these countries owning these other countries. And this has been, through the centuries, a constant. In fact, the artists are sort of the constant of either they reflect it, either they mock it, either they aggrandize it, either they become the bystanders who can see that with a certain distance, even within, because they're artists, and their language is not the language of the spoken language. Their language is, in a way, beyond. And I think that if the students I receive who come from Asia, who come from Europe, who are in America, who are Americans, for instance, they play Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, Chopin, Schumann, Liszt, Bartók, Stravinsky, Prokofiev, Scriabin, and for the ones who want to learn the music of the past before Bach, a lot of Dutch, Flemish, Italian, French, German, of course, but different regions more than a country, since, again, like Italy, it only became a country in the 19th century late. But the ethnic, but the cultural. And it is true that we play music when we teach music on the piano for student pianists to teach them the right way. But in a way, the score already says it. The publishers have made also ethnomusicological or just purely musicological, or if not totally scholarly researches, and give empty explanation in the comments of the score that unfortunately most students don't read, where they define these contexts and the choice of the authenticity of the materials versus the first edition or the earlier editions, or the evolution of the understanding of the notation through different ways of reading it or misunderstanding it, and how they bring you to the authenticity, the ur-text, the original text as a concept of edition. And then you have also the capacity of those who can connect to the, if they exist, manuscripts of the composers, and then see how it evolved through the publishers until today. So yes, in many ways, we have this authenticity research, this capacity through libraries and data banks of awareness of how people heard the music, how people wrote about the music, how people played the music, how people taught that music, the tempi they took compared to a different music school, the way they heard the ornaments, the way they imagined the decoration, the way they defined the interpretation between recomposing or improvising some of the unwritten or suggested by ornaments, elements of the language. In other words, we learn and we teach such niche specificities that isolate a given musician from the rest of the music world, or what music means to the people, and who are the people, the ones who want to use it as entertainment or as faith music or as reflection music, or there are different purposes, and beyond the factual purposes of music as a ritualistic evocation of music through music of life's different situations, it is also something where it makes you travel, like when you read a book, you can read the score. If everybody could read music, they won't need performers. They would just gather or not with an open score and hear it in their heads, just like they read it in their heads, without have somebody read next to them, let's say in a commute or something. Of course, they go to a theater play and somebody reads it for them, and then it takes another dimension, and they say, "Oh, if I knew," but I didn't imagine it that way. Or they read the book and they see adaptation by the movie makers filmmakers or theater or series makers, and they go, "Oh, but they didn't develop enough this character. I imagined this character when I read the book becoming this and that," and this is a beautiful imagination because you can read. And therefore you can read what you want to read into what you read, so to say. And that is what interpretation is, except is one playing for the others listening. And if those don't know, might like or dislike, by criteria of their own unawareness, perhaps they're in a way blessed because this way they're more receptive. And then you have those who know the piece, either because they played it, or either because they taught it, or either because they know about it, because they've heard it often before, and they have comparative interpretations, and they already have their preferences. And you have the inevitable sentence in classical music, audience sentences. If you can hear their minds, you would hear it's not supposed to be played like this. I know what it is. This is too fast, too slow, not enough, not that, too much. Why this rubato? How come this is tasteless? No, they don't know. This style asks for this, and it's not supposed to be played on this instrument. Anyway, I just say that purposely like that as a sort of a snippets of fragments of thoughts that go through the minds of those who know. And then those who don't know go like, "Wow, man, I thought I'll be bored, but that really, really attracts me. I'd like to know more about it. I want to hear more of it." And so I find that the performer at that level it's a hyphen between the dead scroll and the living people. And of course, the more you accumulate interpretations, the more people are choosy about the interpretation. But in fact, they should first know about the piece. So then you have to analyze the piece. You have to understand the piece in order to know what you expect from the piece. And I'd say it's totally understandable to be critical and say, "I don't like it, this tempo, they don't understand." German tradition calls for an andante this, and the Italian tradition for andante is that. Walking compared to adagio, take at ease. Then you can translate the meanings of the indications, but then you have to place them in music. And then you have courantes by Bach in every possible different meter that goes from 16th notes to half notes as a determiner. And what happens is that you cannot define a single tempo for them, because in a way, yes, courante means running, corrente in Italian, so it's a lightly running dance. But if you have a dance, as Bach often writes polyphonically, texture, it's difficult to play it light just for the purpose of fitting the genre of the dance, because in a way it's appropriated by the culture of Bach, like the mazurkas of Chopin, like the Hungarian rhapsodies of Liszt, like Iberia by Albéniz. They choose shades, tastes, aspects, colors, myths, daydreams of a specific aspect of the culture that they depict through their music, or the thoughts that they vehicle through their music, or the charming elements that they determine through their music. Music as such, not music only as background for a song or a background for a movie theater, a storytelling, where inevitably the music is enhancing the psychological depth of a character in the storytelling, and specifically the way the actor is developing it according to the director's desire. And so the music then is unnoticed, because you, as a spectator, one gets overtaken by the complete situation, immersed. Again, that word is very useful. immersed in an ecosystem in which the light, the photography, the costumes, the decor, the choice of the way of everything visually is to do also partly with what is the music suggesting. And you forget the music because you are, it's best when you forget it because it's there. And if perhaps you observe too much that the music is there, is perhaps that the music is overwhelming the image. But when the music doesn't need image or words or text or storytelling or contextualization or studying it or realizing what is the difference of the style, the genre, the time period, and you just hear it for what it is, sounds, perhaps combined with rhythms, pulse, call it what you want. You go like, oh, I like that. I don't know why. I don't know if I should, but it attracts me. And then you unveil the different layers of, and the more you learn, the more you get curious, the more you get curious, the more you go to search for the depth of, you want to understand the origins of it. And perhaps it's not necessary. You should just stay at the level of liking it for the purpose of it. It's like you like this color more than another because, okay, you attribute in some cultures or traditions black to funeral, white to marriage, but in some cultures it's the opposite. So it's all about inevitably cultural or civilizational or social ways of relating nature's sounds and smells and seasons with artistic expressions of life cycles like autumn in the symbolist movement of the French poets of the end of the 19th, early 20th century is old age, and winter is death. No leaves, no life on the bones like branches of the trees. Of course, on the surface, that's very unsubtle to say, but it is factual that spring is budding with life, everything is reborn, is the energy of the photosynthesis, of the irrigation, of cross-pollination, everything blooms, everything fruits, everything becomes alive again. After that, you have summer, where everything is so luxurious and luxuriant and so carefree because of the temperature as well. And when it becomes winter, you have to protect, you have to be attentive, you have to be this, the light of the day is shorter. All kind of things that bring musicians, like in French composers, to express the nature by the rain, the sun rays, the reflection of the water of the sky in the water of oneself, the mirror effects of nature through water, or the when it's not a lake, it's a wave of perpetual evolution of the sea. And so music then evocative, with or without the direct title of the piece, like Boat on the Ocean by Ravel, La Mer de Sea by Debussy, you hear those things embedded, because it's not just a depiction of nature, it's through nature, the nature of mankind, relating to the nature of the environment. And then you go through the instrument, like the piano, which is an action that hits a string, and then you hear only the end of the vibration. It's almost like capturing the tail of a comet in the resonance. But then during that moment that's ephemeral, you capture a harmony that's consonant or dissonant. And then you expect something to resolve. Or perhaps it will go to another dissonance. which will call for another one until you find another solace. And so you organize the storytelling by delaying the arrival point, whether it be cadential or punctuational, like you can write short sentences or long sentences with inserts that come from different points of view that nourish the thought, and then at the end the meaning of the whole point of view comes in, or you organize it in small snippets of phrases where you stay with each fact at a time, but then combine it in your mind afterwards. So the style of literature can bring you to understand differently the things that are conveyed because of the style of the writing, just like music, just like painting, figurative or symbolic or not or none. Music can be atonal or tonal. But all these things have a meaning because they come from either the rejection of a past or an imagination of a future or a desire of perpetuating a present. Some composers like Mozart perpetuated, Stravinsky revolutionized, Beethoven broke down the tradition he received from Haydn, not right away, but nevertheless, in a short time period between Bach's death, end of Baroque, at least in scholarly way, 1750, and Chopin's death, which is sort of the quintessence of the pianistic romanticism, was 1749, 99 years. What is 99 years? In every term, nothing in terms of this cosmos. But even in human range of short lives of the past, it's a lot of evolution of musical expression in such a short time within Europe, with instrumental evolution, harpsichord to piano for the keyboard instrument, with concert halls compared to acoustic rooms of the owners of the areas, whether it be princes or kings or whatever they were. And so the idea that music, like chamber music, was played to read music together around the patron or with a patron, and not like today performed in a concert hall like a concerto or symphony with an orchestra in front of many people, which even for this genre was not used in the past. And of course, with the recording and the capacity electronically to enhance every detail of a piece, you can hear it in a way that is more revisited, nothing by the balances of the orchestration than if you hear it in a hall, the way the composer imagined the balance, because inevitably 4 horns are louder than a flute. And if the flute plays a beautiful melodic line while the French horns hold, and the conductor says shh to the horns and more to the flute, the recording engineer can do that with the sliders on the mix table of the different microphones, and then bring us the sound image more clearly than we would even hear it, in a way perhaps overly so. It's like the middle pedal invention on the piano. It allows to compartment what you hold compared to what you don't hold, so you don't have blur, but sort of individual clarities on different ranges. Or the original pianos that were straight strung with different ranges of sound colors, with the inevitable lack of balance between the ranges, since the piano has one of the largest ranges today, 88 keys, or sometimes more for some models. But the point is that with the cross strings, they resonate by sympathy. Therefore, you have a more homogenized resonance on different ranges, which in a way then kills a little bit of the originality of the choice of the composers to use low notes with a high note, which was really heard as a different instrument, even if it's the same, the piano by timbre, but evocative of a flute, let's say with strings or cellos. All these things are in the imagination of the performer on the piano. You hear a string quartet with the texture of the piece, you imagine it. You hear an opera singer with lyrics, but you imagine it. You play related legato repeated notes because they are for different syllables in the singing, and they don't sound repeated, but on the piano, percussive instrument, in denial of the pianist that it is, we have connection mostly by step motion. But if we have to do it by the repeated note, because Chopin imitates a voice in his nocturnes, on the piano we have to make sure we play legato, singing the repeated notes by replaying them before they lift fully. And not or then we tongue it, pop, 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 ha, ha, ha. And so through different subtle touches of the piano sculpting of the sound extraction through the instrument that is incredibly mechanical between the action of the key and the hammer hitting the string, and the material that touches it, the felt, and what type of felt, and how heavy or light it is, from where it comes, and then the steel strings compared to the gut strings of the past, which were hit by hammers covered with leather. That was in Beethoven's time. Then you had a completely different sound imagination. Of course, the composers composed like Beethoven beyond what they had. He wrote through the piano sonatas that are symphonies on the piano, and quartets on the piano, and who knows what other operas on the piano, like Mozart as well. But in a way, they were not limited by what they had, nor did they perhaps consider it limiting as an instrument. Their imagination was thinking music, not instrument or opera or this genre. They excelled in specific genres for which they had incredible connections of, you can say, attractions. Tchaikovsky in storytelling through ballet and opera, mostly ballet, but opera also beautifully, and symphonic ways to express the same elements, in fact, except without singing, but mainly ballet. Bach, the polyphony on the organ with the fugues, and that translates into his cantatas and the different music of church music that he wrote, the sacred pieces, or the composers, but he still wrote for all the other genres too. And so you can realize that some composers have like Haydn, the string quartet, Beethoven and Mozart in the Viennese first school got it directly from him, but then they shined into different directions and brought it into an orchestra, into an opera, into a symphony and all that. In fact, I'm deeply convinced that composers write music before and beyond for the instrument or the audience. They write it for themselves, in fact. They hear it as a reminiscence from themselves. Socrates used to say, you don't think, you only reminisce. Perhaps that's composers too. At least I feel that at my very, very, very humble, small level. When I compose, compared to all the great composers, I don't know how they compose because they never told me. So I didn't meet them. But I would imagine that perhaps to a certain extent, they might perhaps think what I feel when I want to compose, when I need to compose, when I have a necessity to bring out something from me. It's like as if I rediscover by attentive research a reminiscence of a past that was barely aware of myself, as if I dig it out of myself from some kind of inner work of archaeology of an unknown time that only the intuition drives me close to. I know when it's wrong. I know when I'm in the wrong road digging and to extract it from me. And when I know I'm on the right one, I don't know why, but I know it. It's an intuition. It's like a mother for a child is at the level of, or siblings who are twins. You have this intuition. You know when it's right. You know if the baby is crying because is hungry or other things. You know without to have studied it. You know it because somehow the intuition is the strongest connection to what we call love, by therefore having affection for somebody else than ourselves, as if it's ourselves, even more than for ourselves. Or then it can be for a nation or a culture, of affection for a whole, I don't know, lost time period of life. That's why I'm very deeply convinced that we shouldn't say in classical music, oh, this is French music, or this is Spanish music, or this is Italian music, or this is Russian music. Because for the German music, we never call it German, since they have a continuum of composers for almost 250 or 300 years in classical music for a certain political stability that allowed them to continue having these generations of individuals who questioned the status quo, but who felt part of a, I don't know if it was culture or country or religion or perhaps a little of each or perhaps one of these. But also they are attracted to the mega places where things happened in exchanges of cultures, like Vienna in Austria, Paris, for Europe in general, not only by the countries. And so they're attracted to go there. Beethoven went to Vienna from Bonn, and Mozart went to Vienna from Salzburg. So obviously Vienna was the place to be. And then that's the case for Paris in the Roaring Twenties, and New York, and after that, and all this, London, of course, and for Europe, and of course now everywhere in the world, you can have centers where people develop thoughts, organize, imagine, invent, create. Of course, scientists develop things and rethink the past and reject what was proven by science not to be right, even if it was the belief of the time. So in a way, in art, music, stylistically, you cannot say that later Brahms is rejecting Beethoven, who rejected Haydn, and no, they just, in our eyes, accumulate. And there are more different richnesses that we can dig into, study them, play them, and say, this is Schumann's playing, that it means to me to play like that. I want that statement to be this, because even if it's the way people play it, or I think it should be played against the way people think, because my intuition, or because the way I understood the learning, because not everybody learns the same thing from the same teacher, and then they become in turn their own transmitters in this chain of transmission of their what is the meaningful truth of this or that style and genre. And then they have their disciples who either follow or either for some in fact betray and create their own, because they don't fit into the inheritance, and they prefer to question the status quo, whenever you have others like Chopin, Mozart, Schubert, who just continued it without to question it. But Schoenberg questioned it, Stravinsky questioned it, perhaps Schoenberg more deeply than Stravinsky, and not only for fashion, because Stravinsky sometimes did it also fashionably. But nevertheless, the capacity of a chameleon in music to adopt and adapt and to become an influencer after you were influenced. And of course, the famous names are less considered influenced, like Beethoven from Haydn, because Beethoven by himself is so incredibly important. But in its own way, we can say each composer comes from somewhere in classical music, in their either elected tradition, either their own natural identity of their musical culture, by inheritance or by DNA or by cultural awareness or by revendication for that, or by adopting another culture, like Scarlatti taught the Queen of Spain's children, and Lully invented the French opera, Comédie Ballet, for the King of France. Lully was Italian, and so was Scarlatti, were the Spanish queen or the French king. So you can say, oh, but yeah, Europe at that time was less different because it was ruled by those rulers who imposed on the people and didn't allow them to have their individualities. That is true. To a certain extent, it really becomes so at the fall of the big empires, the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Prussian at the end of World War I. And you have, therefore, then the national eclosions of these regional specificities, when during the Austrian Empire, between Mozart's Vienna and Prague, where Don Giovanni was premiered, and the flute, magic flute in Vienna, it was a regional, at best, difference, and not much. The Bohemian Czech Republic today, if it were composers or Slovak or whatever, were Mozart's colleagues with whom he played chamber music for the patrons, like many of them, Van Hal on the cello, and so today they were Czech, then they were part of the Austrian Empire, and more than their national identities that became to be, it was mostly the style that was common in terms of the grammar, the tonal music grammar. And they didn't feel like they were alike because they were all individually evolving through their life. If they could live longer, it would be better, like Haydn. But some like Mozart, Mendelssohn, Weber, they died in their 20s, 30s, which to us is super short. To that time was short, but not that short. Nevertheless, they didn't spend too much time learning. First of all, there was not so much available awareness of factual documents of their musical past to study from, and also they learned the trade of their present, which was the style of the day, and they evolved it through their melodicity or their rhythmicity or their harmonic expression. So it's, again, that's why I believe the quality of the individual who retrieves some kind of music from their own immersed I love that word, I use it too much. Immersed reminiscence of something that they feel like they belong to when they compose it or when they play it and they perform it. And of course, until the beginning of the 20th century in classical music, essentially, all musicians were by essence just everything. At necessity or by calling. There were and composers and performers and sight readers and teachers and improvisers and keyboard harmonists and orchestrators and. In fact, possibly not much of each, but a little bit of all. In our eyes of today, where we are a little, and very little of all. Because in fact, the amount of knowledge that is accumulated and available is such that we can spend our life studying, and in a way then, where is our own creativity of our present? Their present was immediate, and in a way, that's why this 99 years between Bach's death and Chopin's death seems so unbelievable when you know classical music evolution of stylistic language, from the form to the breaking of the form, from before the form, from the modal to the tonal and the establishment of the tonality, and then the breaking of it, from the ethnic elements to the classical elements of the style of the place, where it was an imposition by a given prince or a given style that was in fashion. And so same thing with Shostakovich, with Stalinism, and who did things on the side, but also provided music for the Stalin court, so to say, if it were. But it is the same thing. The artists were used for propaganda purposes, and in every time period, in fact. And but within all that, they were individuals, poets, writers, painters, thinkers, circus actors, name it, commedia dell'arte, all forms of narrating the story of humankind and their shortcomings. Dramatic, comical, reflective, uplifting spiritually. Probably it's because humans are all of that at the same time. They cannot compartment and say, I'm going to be only this or only that. And if they try, even with good faith, it's tough. More than ever today, when everything is everywhere, available all the time, you have to be able to still, by cultivated knowledge, by studying the specificities, provide an awareness of the difference between, like, those who compare plants or those who compare birds, they know the subtleties of the differences that our ecosystems bring to become, or were, or evolved. Same way for art forms and styles. The more you are aware, the more you are subtle, the more you are able to appreciate every innuendo in a given artwork that might escape somebody less trained to it. But at the level of initial emotional connection, I think it doesn't need to be explained. It's after you fall in love that you want to understand. And perhaps the wisdom is to give up understanding in order to continue to love.